When I say underwater archaeology, what do people think of? I actually, huh? Bob Ballard. Shipwrecks. Well, I'm going to tell you about finding archaeological sites underwater. Except these sites, you're not going to be able to see them like the Titanic. I mean, you know, how could you miss that sucker on the bottom of the ocean? No, what I do is I look for the very tiniest fragments of rock, and they can tell me that there has been people hanging out on the lake bottom. So, picture this. We're going to go into the Wayback Machine 10,000 years ago in the Great Lakes, middle of North America, except at this time, they're not really Great Lakes. They're great puddles. Because when the glaciers left, we had all this weight. So just picture several kilometers of ice pushing down on the landscape, and they leave. And so what happens? Just like a sponge, after you raise your hand off of it, the land rebounds. So what happens is when this land rebounds, the outlets to the Great Lake gets turned off, just kind of like turning off the tap of a bathtub. Combine that with colder, drier temperatures, and all of a sudden we're dealing with Great Lakes that, first of all, aren't even connected anymore. They're all separate little puddles, as I mentioned. And then there's all of this land that's available for people to hang out in. This is great. There's archaeological sites potentially on this land, except now it's under a couple of tens of meters of water. So how the heck do we find these sites? Well, prehistoric peoples, when they make a stone tool, they sit there. Have anybody here ever done, anybody here ever seen a flint knapper work? Yeah. Okay, so if you'll notice when a flint knapper works, they produce this nice stone tool, but what they also produce is a whole bunch of little bits, okay? The smallest, tiniest fragments, less than a millimeter. Now, one of the cool things about this stuff is that it goes everywhere. It sticks, it gets in your hair. It can actually, apparently you can actually, it gets in your nose, right? And you can actually have debitage snot, okay, that comes out of these fragments. So this stuff gets pushed all over the place. And the best part is that it stays there. Instead of the stone tool that gets carried off to another site, it actually stays there. So what we do is we go and we go down, we use divers, we get some of the sediment, and we look at it and we can find this micro-debitage. That's the fancy word for it. It's stone tool dust. And by looking at that, we can actually determine that people were hanging out in these underwater landscapes in the Great Lakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Judges.
It's like this light issue. So am I in the light? Am I ready? I'm ready for my close-up. Sorry. Sorry.
So you've talked a little bit about how you find these sites.
Mm-hmm.
Are you actually excavating the sites? How do you excavate if they're buried underwater?
Actually, you don't excavate them. You can to a certain extent. Normally what they do, in this particular site that I'm working on, there isn't a lot of sediment, and there's maybe 6 inches of sediment on top. So anything that we're going to find is going to be right on top. And generally what we do is we collect it, we mark it. We have our little ROV dude that skims along, gives us a GPS coordinate. And we'll usually use divers to pick it up. A lot of times what they do is like land archaeology, they'll put a big square down, like a 1 meter by 1 meter square down on the lake bottom, and they'll basically vacuum up everything. And then they pull it up into the ship up above board, and then they screen it, just the same way you see archaeologists screening material, and they do it that way. So right now, we're kind of just getting a sense of what's actually on this landscape. So we're not actually really doing any excavation yet. So when we get a little more material, we'll probably start excavating, but how we're going to do that, we're not entirely sure.
So just to be clear, you're not suggesting that people were flaking stone tools in a big giant puddle?
No, they were flaking stone tools beside the giant puddle.
Which is now a Great Lake.
Which is now a Great Lake, okay. Yes.
How early do you think these sites are? You said 10,000 years.
Yeah, we actually have from one of the areas we've been working on, we have what looks like a little fire pit, with charcoal in it, and the charcoal has been radiocarbon dated to 9,000 years ago.
Wow, so very early.
Very early, yes.
So, I'm still in the spongy, thing going up and down, and here's what I'm wondering: if you run water in your yard with a hose, and you create sort of a river, and the stuff in your garden goes down the little river. So how do you know that what you're finding originated there and didn't come from someplace else?
So the tricky part is what we end up doing is we look at these little pieces, these little fragments that we think are made by people, and we put them under a really, really highly powered microscope, a scanning electron microscope. And we actually look for specific features on these little pieces. And in fact, they're like baby flakes. They look exactly like the kind of bigger flake you might see in an archaeological site, but they're really, really small. They're microscopic. And we see the same kinds of markings on these little microscopic flakes that we see on larger flakes, but we have to actually put them under a really high-powered microscope. That didn't answer your question, did it? No, it really didn't. Okay, so what, can you rephrase so I can?
I get that they look like the big things.
Right.
Okay. But how do you know that that's where they came from and they didn't wash in there at some point when your sponge was going up or down?
Really what you have to do is look at the landscape as a whole. So some of the things we do in addition to looking at the microdebitage is we'll look at things like pollen, testate amoebas, which are little critters. And a lot of times these can tell us if our landscape was stable or not. So for instance, we might have some of these little critters that are actually telling us that there was a river channel there. So maybe that material that we find might actually have been washed in. In some cases, it's actually embedded in sediment that we know was stable. For instance, like peat, the kind of stuff you get in a wetland. So if you look at anybody here ever taken material from a swamp, and it's like really stinky, but it's solid material. So if we actually find the debitage or the stone tool dust in this peat, we figure that it was probably it was probably there in what we like to call archaeologists in situ, which means in place, so it hasn't moved. So you really have to look at the big picture of the environment to determine whether or not you're dealing with something that somebody actually, was doing their thing and actually, spread the stone dust around, or if it was something that might have been washed in from another process.